She was a princess who dared to dream of a throne, wealth, and power greater than any woman in the Tang dynasty had ever held. But at only 24 years old, she was forced to lift a poisoned cup and end her life in silence. This is the tragic fate of Princess Anle, the daughter of Empress Wu Zetian and Emperor Zhongzong, whose ambition challenged the dynasty itself. Princess Anle, born during the height of the Tang dynasty, entered a world overflowing with grandeur, power, and expectations. She was the daughter of Emperor Zhongzong of Tang and Empress Wu Zetian, a lineage that positioned her not only at the heart of China's imperial family, but also at the very center of one of the most magnificent dynasties in history. Her life began within the golden palaces of Chang'an, the beating heart of the empire, where every corridor was filled with whispers of poetry, politics, and intrigue. From the earliest years, she was cradled in luxuries unimaginable to ordinary people. Golden ornaments adorned her chambers, silk garments brushed against her skin, and the fragrance of rare spices lingered in the halls she walked. Musicians played melodies to ease her sleep, and attendants hovered constantly to fulfill her smallest whims. For Anle, childhood was a stage dressed in magnificence, but beneath the layers of silk and ceremony lay something deeper: the heavy burden of expectation. Her grandmother, Wu Zetian, had already shattered the unbreakable traditions of patriarchy by seizing the throne for herself, declaring the Zhou dynasty, and ruling as the only woman in Chinese history to reign in her own name. This act of defiance reverberated through the empire. For young Anle, it became a guiding star. If her grandmother could command an empire, then perhaps she too could one day ascend to the throne. But life within the palace was not merely filled with grandeur. It was also a nest of political serpents. Every smile could mask betrayal. Every gift could carry hidden malice. Anle grew up watching alliances form and collapse, observing ministers bow with humility, but plot with daggers hidden behind their backs. These early impressions carved into her the understanding that survival in the palace required not only privilege, but also cunning. While her peers in the palace, other princesses and noble ladies, were content to enjoy embroidery, music, or poetry, Anle displayed a different temperament. She absorbed the lessons of history, listened keenly to her grandmother's stories of strategy, and witnessed how her mother, Empress Wei, maneuvered to secure influence beside Emperor Zhongzong. It was within this crucible of power that Anle's own character was forged. Sharp, ambitious, and relentless. Her youth was painted with contradictions. She was adored by her father, who indulged her with gifts and titles, but she also grew restless with the limitations imposed on her gender. While others saw her as a jewel of the dynasty, Anle saw herself as a potential heir, someone who could push past boundaries and rewrite her destiny. Every corridor of the palace echoed with footsteps of men who decided the future of the empire, and she longed to be one of them. Thus, the childhood of Princess Anle was not simply the story of a girl surrounded by wealth. It was the emergence of a spirit shaped by both privilege and ambition. From the very beginning, she was more than a daughter of the Tang dynasty. She was a seed of disruption, destined to challenge the natural order of succession. Her story, like the dynasty itself, glowed with brilliance, but shadows were already gathering, waiting to test her dreams. As Princess Anle grew older, her ambitions became unmistakable. Unlike many women of her station who found comfort in the safety of noble marriages or ceremonial duties, she harbored dreams that defied tradition. She looked upon the throne not as a distant, unattainable seat of power reserved for men, but as a destiny that could be claimed. Her grandmother, Wu Zetian's precedent, was a powerful source of inspiration. To Anle, Wu Zetian was not simply a legendary figure, but proof that the impossible could be made possible. Stories of her grandmother's rise, from a concubine to the only female emperor, were whispered like forbidden scripture in the palace, tales that other princesses might dismiss as extraordinary anomalies. But Anle absorbed them as lessons. She saw herself as the heir to this audacity, destined to follow the same path of defiance. Her confidence was not without foundation. Emperor Zhongzong cherished his daughter with an affection that bordered on obsession. He granted her privileges that far exceeded those of her siblings, showering her with jewels, estates, and influence. Anle's presence in court was not symbolic. It was active, commanding, and threatening to those who valued the traditional structures of succession. She learned to manipulate her father's love, bending his will to accommodate her desires. Her marriage further strengthened her position. She wed Wu Chongshun, the son of Wu Sanxi, a powerful official and ally of Empress Wei. This union bound her more tightly to the Wu clan, the same family that had once elevated Wu Zetian to power. Together with her mother, Anle became part of a formidable network that reached into the heart of the court. Yet, it was her audacity that distinguished her most of all. She demanded more than riches. She sought legitimacy as the successor to her father. On several occasions, she openly pressured Emperor Zhongzong to depose the crown prince Li Chongjun, her half-brother. In the eyes of Anle, her claim was justified not merely by her father's affection, but also by her lineage as the granddaughter of Wu Zetian. The audacity of a princess demanding the throne shook the foundations of tradition and ignited whispers among ministers and courtiers. These ambitions, however, carried great peril. The Tang court was a stage of fragile balances, where loyalty shifted with the winds of politics. Her determination to replace the crown prince drew the ire of powerful factions, who saw in her not only arrogance, but also a dangerous echo of Wu Zetian's reign. Ministers feared the return of another female ruler who might upend centuries of patriarchal control. But Anle did not waver. Every denial from her father seemed only to sharpen her resolve. Every whisper of opposition became fuel for her defiance. For her, the throne was no longer a dream, but an expectation. And in pursuing it, she began to weave a web of alliances and intrigues that would eventually entangle her fate. Her ambition was not just unusual, it was radical. A direct challenge to the dynastic order. In an empire where women's power was tolerated only in shadows, Anle sought to step into the light. This desire, bold yet perilous, set her on a collision course with forces far greater than herself. It was the beginning of a tragedy, where the brilliance of her dream would one day be extinguished in silence. With the support of her mother, Empress Wei, Princess Anle's influence reached far beyond the privileges of an imperial daughter. Empress Wei, ambitious and calculating, saw in her daughter not only a beloved child, but also the possibility of continuing the legacy of female authority carved out by Wu Zetian. Together, mother and daughter became an inseparable pair, moving through the corridors of the palace like twin flames of ambition. The partnership between Empress Wei and Princess Anle was formidable. Wei, having secured her own power as the wife of Emperor Zhongzong, used her position to cultivate alliances, remove opponents, and dominate the emperor's court. Anle, intelligent and audacious, complemented her mother's political maneuvers with her own boldness. Ministers who once believed they could ignore a princess soon realized that she held influence that rivaled that of princes and senior officials. The emperor himself seemed trapped between affection and manipulation. Emperor Zhongzong adored his daughter with a blind devotion that sometimes unsettled his court. He was known to grant her requests without hesitation, even when they carried political consequences. Officials whispered about how she extracted extravagant gifts and properties, how entire estates were transferred into her possession, and how she used these resources to tighten her hold over others. Such behavior fueled resentment. In the eyes of the nobility, Anle and her mother embodied arrogance and corruption. Their accumulation of wealth and power appeared excessive, even dangerous, as though they were constructing a separate kingdom within the empire. Whispers grew louder that Empress Wei aspired to emulate Wu Zetian by seizing the throne for herself, and that Anle dreamed of inheriting this ambition. This perception of greed and overreach turned Anle into a target of hostility. Ministers and princes, who once might have ignored the schemes of an imperial woman, began to see her as a threat. Her demands to displace the crown prince only deepened these suspicions. The palace, already a nest of intrigue, became a battlefield where Anle and her mother stood at the center of controversy. Yet Anle herself seemed unfazed by the hostility. Shielded by her father's love and her mother's power, she walked the palace with the confidence of someone untouchable. She believed that her destiny, like her grandmother's, was unshakable. She dismissed criticism as envy, considering herself a figure of historical inevitability. However, power within the Tang dynasty was never static. Factions shifted with the tides of fortune, and enemies lurked in silence, waiting for the moment of weakness. By aligning so closely with her mother, Anle tied her fate to Empress Wei's ambitions. The mother's shadow became the daughter's armor, but it was also a chain. Should Wei stumble, Anle would fall with her. In the years before the emperor's death, this uneasy balance teetered dangerously. The resentment of the nobility swelled, and the memory of Wu Zetian's reign remained fresh in the minds of those who feared another female ruler. Anle's growing influence no longer seemed like the innocent indulgence of a doting father. Instead, it looked like the rising storm of another usurpation. The court watched with sharpened eyes, knowing that the moment would come when ambition would collide with resistance. Thus, in the glow of her mother's power, Princess Anle shone brightly, but it was a brilliance that provoked dread rather than admiration. The seeds of tragedy had already been sown. The throne, for Princess Anle, was not a distant dream, but a tangible goal. She envisioned herself not merely as a princess, but as the sovereign ruler of the Tang dynasty. To achieve this, she turned her focus on the obstacle that stood in her way. The crown prince, Li Chongjun, her half-brother. Anle's campaign against Li Chongjun was relentless. She whispered to her father, Emperor Zhongzong, urging him to depose the crown prince. She argued that Chongjun lacked the charisma, the strength, and the vision required of a ruler. In contrast, she portrayed herself as the true inheritor of Wu Zetian's legacy, the one who could bring glory to the dynasty by embodying both imperial blood and female resilience. Her arguments were not merely private pleas. She openly mocked and humiliated the crown prince, treating him as unworthy of the position. Such behavior bred bitterness and humiliation. Li Chongjun, though heir apparent, found himself overshadowed in the court by his sister's audacity. To be scorned publicly by a woman in the patriarchal world of Tang politics was an insult that could not be ignored. Emperor Zhongzong wavered. On one hand, his affection for his daughter was boundless. On the other, he understood the storm that would erupt should he attempt to alter the succession. Ministers, princes, and generals would resist fiercely. The throne of the Tang dynasty was not a prize to be shifted at the whim of paternal love. The emperor's hesitation reflected both political reality and personal weakness. The tension between Anle and the crown prince escalated until it boiled over in violence. In 707, Li Chongjun, unable to bear further humiliation, launched a desperate rebellion against Empress Wei, Anle, and their allies. Though the revolt was swiftly crushed, it revealed how deep the wounds had become. The crown prince's failed uprising only heightened suspicions about Anle's ambitions, confirming to many that she sought to usurp the natural order of succession. For Anle, the rebellion was both a danger and an opportunity. Though her half-brother was disgraced and killed, the attempt to seize power only hardened opposition to her. She believed the path to the throne had been cleared, but in truth, it had been poisoned. Every official now looked at her with sharper suspicion, every alliance became fragile, and every whisper carried a tone of dread. Still, Anle persisted. Her confidence bordered on obsession. She refused to see the throne as unattainable, convinced that her father's love and her mother's power would eventually bend the empire to her will. But beneath this determination lay a dangerous blindness. She underestimated the strength of her enemies, the resentment of the nobility, and the fragility of her father's reign. The dream of the throne consumed her, burning away the caution that might have preserved her life. Each step she took toward power tightened the noose around her neck, binding her fate ever closer to disaster. What she saw as destiny, history would reveal as folly. A dream that led her not to a crown, but to a poisoned cup. In the summer of 710, Emperor Unveiled of Tang died suddenly under circumstances that have puzzled historians for centuries. The official record stated that his death was natural, but whispers within the palace and later chronicles suggested otherwise. Many believed that Empress Wei, with the support of Princess Anle, had orchestrated his demise through poison in order to seize control of the empire. The theory was not without foundation. Empress Wei had long aspired to follow in the footsteps of Wu Zetian, who had transformed herself from consort to emperor. Anle, as her daughter, nurtured similar ambitions. With Zhongzong's health faltering and his judgment often clouded by indulgence, mother and daughter may have seen an opportunity. By eliminating the emperor, they could bypass the fragile authority of the crown prince and consolidate power in their own hands. Whether true or not, the suspicion was enough to define history's perception of them. Zhongzong's death shocked the empire. Court officials, generals, and members of the royal clan were thrown into uncertainty. But within the palace, Empress Wei and Princess Anle moved swiftly. They positioned themselves at the center of the succession crisis, determined to dominate the fragile political order left in the wake of the emperor's passing. Anle's grief, if it existed, was overshadowed by her ambitions. She had loved her father, but she also saw in his death the chance to finally realize her dream. As mourning rituals unfolded, she and her mother pulled the strings of government, manipulating decrees and reshaping the court to secure their power. For many ministers, however, the sudden death of the emperor combined with the aggressive moves of Empress Wei and Anle confirmed their worst fears. The dynasty seemed poised to descend into another era of female dominance, one that could rival the reign of Wu Zetian. Nobles and princes who had long tolerated Anle's arrogance now saw her as a usurper in waiting, a direct threat to the stability of the Tang dynasty. Meanwhile, the empire itself trembled. Soldiers whispered about betrayal in the palace. The people in Chang'an mourned their emperor, but gossip about poisoning spread quickly through the streets. Rumors painted Princess Anle as a schemer who had hastened her father's death to claim the throne. True or false, these stories would follow her forever, feeding the legend of her ruthless ambition. Thus, the death of Emperor Zhongzong was not just the end of a reign. It was the spark that ignited a storm. For Anli, it seemed like the gateway to her long-desired destiny. For her enemies, it was the final confirmation that she and her mother had to be stopped. The stage was set for a violent confrontation, one that would end her dreams in blood and silence. In the days following Emperor Zhongzong's death, the palace became a crucible of fear and ambition. Empress Wei and Princess Anle acted quickly, declaring plans to enthrone a puppet emperor, the young son of Zhongzong, while they would rule from behind the throne. It was a strategy modeled on Wu Zetian's path to power, and Anle prepared herself as the ultimate heir to her mother's authority. But they underestimated the resistance. The Tang court was not the same as during Wu Zetian's time. Memories of a woman ruling the empire were still raw, and many nobles and princes vowed never to allow such a disruption again. The powerful Princess Taiping, sister of Zhongzong, and Prince Li Longji, who would later become Emperor Xuanzong, moved swiftly to oppose Wei and Anle. The coup unfolded in terrifying speed. Soldiers loyal to Li Longji stormed the palace, cutting down guards and breaking through the walls of Wei's carefully constructed power. Panic spread through the imperial chambers as the balance of power shifted in a single night. Empress Wei, caught off guard, was executed almost immediately. Her body, once adorned with silks and jewels, was left lifeless, a grim warning to all who might dare to reach too far. Anle's fate was sealed the moment the soldiers broke into her quarters. No longer a princess cloaked in privilege, she was dragged from her golden chambers, stripped of power, and branded as a conspirator. The girl who once commanded respect and fear was reduced to a prisoner in her own palace. The dream of ruling that had sustained her since childhood dissolved in an instant. The throne she had so desperately coveted was now farther from her than ever before. Instead of a crown, she faced the judgment of a dynasty determined to erase her name from history. For those who orchestrated the coup, eliminating Empress Wei and Princess Anle was not just political necessity, it was survival. They believed that if left unchecked, Anle would inherit her mother's ambition and attempt once again to seize power. By crushing her now, they ensured that no shadow of Wu Zetian would ever rise again. Thus, the palace that had once been her sanctuary became her prison. The silken drapes that had once shielded her dreams now felt like suffocating shrouds. Her laughter, which had once echoed in marble halls, was replaced with silence. The girl who once believed she could bend history now found herself broken by it. The coup of 710 was swift, brutal, and absolute. Empress Wei was dead, the Wu faction annihilated, and Princess Anle, once the most powerful woman in the Tang court after her mother, was left with nothing but the slow dread of an inevitable end. The fall of her dream was not a gradual decline, but a sudden collapse, as though the empire itself had conspired to crush her ambition in a single blow. The downfall of Princess Anle was as swift as it was devastating. Only days earlier, she had stood at the center of power, her words echoing in the imperial court, her ambitions burning brighter than the lamps that lit the palace corridors. Now, she was nothing more than a captive. The coup led by Princess Taiping and Prince Li Longji had shattered everything she and her mother had built. When the soldiers stormed the palace, Anle's confidence dissolved into fear. She had grown up in a world where her every desire was granted, where she believed her destiny was unshakable. But power, she learned too late, was never truly secure. Stripped of her titles, her attendants dismissed, she was thrust into a reality that no amount of jewels or silks could shield her from. Her mother's death was both a warning and a tragedy. Empress Wei, executed without ceremony, was denied the dignity of remembrance. For Anle, the sight of her mother's downfall must have been a shattering moment. The woman who had been her shield, her mentor, and her co-conspirator was gone, leaving her alone to face the wrath of her enemies. The court wasted no time in branding Anle a traitor. She was accused of plotting to seize the throne, of conspiring with her mother to poison the emperor, and of daring to challenge the sacred order of succession. Though she may have been young, her actions had threatened the very foundation of the dynasty. To her enemies, her punishment was not only justified, it was necessary. Yet in the silence of her confinement, Anle must have replayed her life like fragments of a broken dream. She remembered the indulgent smile of her father, the whispered encouragement of her mother, the golden halls where she once imagined herself seated as empress. Now those visions mocked her, each memory cutting deeper than the last. At 24 years old, she was forced to confront the reality that her story would not end with triumph. There would be no throne, no empire to command, no legacy of power. Her fall was not gradual, but catastrophic, a collapse that crushed both her body and her dreams. The court's judgment was clear. Her ambitions had gone too far, and her life would serve as the ultimate warning. The dream that had once defined her existence was now the very reason for her destruction. Princess Anle's downfall was more than personal tragedy. It was a symbol of how fragile ambition could be in the face of dynastic power. In her quest for the throne, she had believed she could defy tradition. But the weight of history proved otherwise. Her fall was not simply the loss of a crown, but the erasure of her place in the story of the Tang dynasty. There was no trial, no chance for Princess Anle to defend herself before the court. The decision of the new rulers was swift and merciless. She would die, not by public execution, but by poison. This method carried its own cruel symbolism. It was a death reserved for members of the imperial family, a way of silencing them while preserving the illusion of dignity. In a dim chamber, far removed from the splendor of the palace she once commanded, a servant placed before her a single cup filled with poison. The liquid shimmered faintly in the light of the lamp, an unassuming vessel that carried the weight of her entire fate. At 24, Anle faced the end she had never imagined for herself. Her hands, once adorned with rings of jade and gold, now trembled as they held the cup. In her eyes, there must have been a storm of emotions: anger at her enemies, grief for her mother, bitterness for her lost dreams, and perhaps a flicker of disbelief that her story had come to this. The silence of that room was heavier than any outcry. No courtiers bowed, no musicians played, no attendants flattered her. She was alone, as all ambitious souls ultimately are when stripped of power. The girl who had once envisioned herself as ruler of the Tang dynasty now faced her mortality with only the cold company of poison. Historians imagine that her final moments were filled with defiance. Perhaps she cursed the dynasty that condemned her, or perhaps she clung to the memory of Wu Zetian, believing her grandmother would understand the price of ambition. Or perhaps she drank in silence, accepting that resistance was futile against the unstoppable tide of history. When she lifted the cup to her lips, she carried more than her own sorrow. She carried the weight of a broken dream, the echo of her mother's ambitions, and the shadow of her grandmother's precedent. The poison ended her life swiftly, but it did not erase the bitterness that surrounded her memory. Princess Anle died not on a battlefield or in a public square, but in the suffocating quiet of a private chamber. Her death was designed to erase her from memory, to transform her into a warning rather than a martyr. The silence that followed was louder than any proclamation. Her story ended in that moment. Yet the tragedy of her life continued to resonate. For in the act of drinking the poisoned cup, Anle became more than just a fallen princess. She became a symbol of ambition crushed by history. A reminder that even within the grandeur of the Tang dynasty, dreams could be silenced with a single sip. After her death, Princess Anle's name was deliberately erased from the living memory of the Tang dynasty. The court, now dominated by Princess Taiping and Prince Li Longji, treated her as if she had never existed. No grand burial was arranged, no memorial erected, and no poems were written in her honor. She vanished from the records of her own family, silenced not only by poison, but also by history itself. In the great halls of Chang'an, her presence was quickly replaced by the voices of those who had triumphed over her. Ministers who once bowed before her ignored her memory. Generals who once feared her influence spoke of her only as a lesson in arrogance. Even within the palace, attendants who had once scrambled to serve her every command were reassigned, their loyalty washed away as though it had never been. Her death became a warning whispered among courtiers. Whenever another woman in the imperial household showed signs of ambition, the story of Princess Anle was evoked like a shadow, an unspoken reminder that defying the patriarchal order led only to destruction. To the dynasty, she was not remembered as a daughter of emperors, but as an example of what must never be repeated. Yet silence has a peculiar power. The absence of her memory in official records only deepened the mystery around her. Historians centuries later would piece together fragments of her story, finding in the gaps of history the outlines of a young woman whose dreams threatened an empire. The lack of a proper tomb, the deliberate erasure of her achievements, and the absence of mourning all spoke louder than words. They revealed the fear she had inspired in life and the danger she represented even in death. Her fate illustrates the cruelty of dynastic politics. For a princess born into unimaginable privilege, her end was lonely, obscure, and humiliating. She was denied the dignity of remembrance, condemned to wander the shadows of forgotten history. In the silence that followed her death, her enemies achieved their greatest victory. They made her a ghost not only in life, but also in memory. And yet, no dynasty can completely erase its own contradictions. The very effort to silence her became evidence of her power. If she had been insignificant, there would have been no need to wipe her name away. The silence that surrounded Princess Anle was therefore not emptiness. It was the echo of a life that had disturbed the order of an empire. The tragic life of Princess Anle stands as a haunting reminder of how ambition and power can consume even the most privileged. She was born into wealth, nurtured by affection, and empowered by the precedent of her grandmother, Wu Zetian. She dared to imagine herself on the throne of the Tang dynasty, a place no other princess had ever aspired to claim. Yet her dreams, bold and unrelenting, became the very force that led to her destruction. Her death at 24 was not just the loss of a young life. It was the collapse of an audacious vision. Anle believed that she could bend history to her will, that her lineage and her intelligence were enough to overcome the boundaries of gender and tradition. But the dynasty responded with ruthless force, demonstrating that no individual, no matter how ambitious, could stand against the weight of imperial order. Her story is not one of triumph, but of caution. It reveals how the same forces that elevate can also destroy. The love of her father, which granted her influence, also made her reckless. The ambition of her mother, which gave her strength, also tied her to a doomed fate. The precedent of her grandmother, which inspired her, also painted her as a threat that could not be allowed to live. Princess Anle's life reminds us that history often punishes those who challenge its rules too directly. Her ambition, though remarkable, was out of harmony with the currents of her time. In seeking to claim the throne, she awakened the fears of a dynasty that had only just recovered from the reign of Wu Zetian. The empire could not risk another disruption, and so it silenced her before she could become too powerful. Yet there is something undeniably human in her tragedy. She was a young woman who dreamed beyond the limits imposed upon her. She refused to settle for a life of ceremonial duty and luxury, and instead reached for something greater. In that defiance, she revealed both her strength and her vulnerability. Her fall was not simply the punishment of arrogance, it was the cost of daring to dream, in a world that was not ready to accept her vision. Today, Princess Anle survives not in monuments or official chronicles, but in the margins of history, where her life is retold as both a warning and a lament. She is remembered as the doomed princess who reached too high, whose ambition was crushed by the forces of tradition and power. But she is also remembered as a figure of tragic courage, whose dreams, though unfulfilled, continue to echo through time. Her life, brief and brilliant, is a testament to the dual nature of ambition. It can inspire, but it can also destroy. For Princess Anle, ambition was both her crown and her curse. At 24 years old, she drank from a cup of poison, and with that final act, she became immortal in tragedy. A symbol of how even in the grandest dynasties, dreams can be silenced but never entirely forgotten.